And we've got the video and the audio going. So we can get started. It's 7 o'clock, and I wanted to welcome everybody here. Everybody was very excited. I got so many reservations for tonight's talk. I can really see that this birding group is totally involved in birds. We get a lot more enthusiasm when the subject is birds, and we're very fortunate to have Kevin Burns from San Diego State here, who's not only the head of the ornithology group out there, but also an expert in tanagers. But before we hear from Kevin, I'll hand it over to Tina. And Tina, you can do the opening prayer.
Sure, thanks. I have nothing to say about the Payam and tanagers, but so if you want to go get a glass of water, feel free. But it's an important somber anniversary coming up next month before we meet again. And I wanted to talk for just a minute about it. We here in North County, we're on the land of the Payam, which also are known as the Luiseños. They run from Encinitas up way north through Orange County and from the ocean to Palomar is their territory. And there's another, there are 4 tribes in San Diego County, and a second one that's really closely aligned to the Payam or the Cupeño, which is a very small group that originally were located in Warner Springs, if you know where that is. It's northeast of Lake Henshaw, in a really lovely area. And some rich people bought the land from Mexican, all sorts of land grant stuff going on with the Mexican land grants. And through a long series of lawsuits that ended up in the Supreme Court, the U.S. Supreme Court in 1901 or 2 said that the indigenous people, the Cupeños, had no right to be on that land and they had to leave. And they had no choice but to leave. So this was the removal of the Cupeños. Some historians call it the Cupeño Trail of Tears. If you know anything about Indian nations around, there's a lot of Trail of Tears where people were marched or whatever from their homeland to reservations. So May 12th began the Cupeño removal. And basically, Warner Springs, like in today's land, you would go down 79 around Lake Henshaw and then come up the 76. And you go through all of the Payam reservations here in North County by taking that route. And that's the route the Cupeño people were forced to take. And Amy Admire, who's from the Rincon Reservation, told a story and taught us a little song. But the image, I think, is just a lovely image in a despairing time. As the Cupeño people were walking, they weren't really walking. They had people lend them carts and they had horses and things like that. So they weren't walking, but because it was a 3-day journey. But as the people passed through the villages, the Payam villages, the Payam who had had their own removals earlier, came out and stood along the side of the path and sang a very simple song to the people as they passed through. The languages are very similar. And so it was a 2-part song. The first part was, and I could actually sing it for you, but the first words were hello in Payam language, which is Chamtela, and then hello in the Cupeño language, which I don't know what they call it. And then the second part was my house, your house. My house, your house. And so as these people filled with despair and having no idea what was it, they were going to Pala. They were being sent to Pala. So the Payam people greeted them, welcomed them as they went past. And here's the little song. It's mi you miawech, mi you miawech, mi you miawech, mi you miawech. Noki, 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 oki. no key, no key. And they just repeated those two phrases over and over as the people went by. And the languages were similar enough that, as Amy said, if your mother-in-law was Cupeño, you did not say bad things about her in Chamtela because she would understand what you were saying,
Mm.
even if she wasn't a native speaker. So it was just, it's this lovely image of shared historical trauma in a very visual way, and to put sort of a less despairing period on it. um, the Cupeño removal was the last federal mandate of moving indigenous nations off their homelands because some other rich guy wanted their land. They have been moved, people have been moved for construction or a dam being built, or things like that. But the Cupeños were kind of represented the final bookend on really bad relationships between federal government and indigenous nations. And nowadays, the world has, ironically, Neil Gorsuch on the Supreme Court is extraordinarily strong on issues about Native rights. I don't agree with him on much, but he's a solid thinker in my book on Native rights. And it's just, anyway, May 12th to May 14th is the Cupeña removal, and 1903. So we're 123 years from that.
Wow.
Anyway, there are also the Kumeyaay and the Cahuilla nations are in San Diego County too, who had their own issues. We don't have to get into those, but I appreciate your listening because this is not often talked about, and it's kind of part of the Amy's issue was it's kind of part of the erasure that nobody really knows about this little snippet of history. So thank you for listening.
Well, thank you, Tina. I think you have a book in you. I hope. I would love to
Oh, I am not the one to write it.
see this written down.
I'm an ally, but I'm not the one to write it.
Well, I'm sure you've had enough of that, right? Well, thank you. And I'll introduce Kevin now. Kevin, what can I say about Kevin except that he's been a birder for, I think, since he was 9. He started pursuing birding, and he not only made it his passionate hobby, but he has made his career centered around ornithology and biology at San Diego State University. He's been there for 28 years, has accomplished an awful lot, and as detailed in the newsletter, has written a number of scientific papers, has a lot of publications, etc. And tonight he's going to talk to us about what exactly is a tanager. And he kind of teased it a little bit in his piece in the newsletter. And also when we were talking, he informed me that the tanagers that we have here are really not tanagers. So, but he kept me in suspense. So I will find out the answer to that question and what really is a tanager tonight in his talk. He has studied. There are 400 species of tanagers, as we were discussing earlier this evening, in just about every color that you can imagine. You need to go to Latin America, go south to see tanagers. I don't know if there's any other parts of the world, but I'm sure he will inform us of this, and he's going to be sharing some surprising findings in research regarding tanagers. So I'm anxious to turn it over to Kevin. Yes, Patty, do you have a question?
Yeah, we have some background noise, so if everybody could just mute their audio, their volume. So if you use your mouse and you go down to the lower left-hand corner, there's an audio button. If you just hover your mouse over it and just click that, then you won't be interrupting the speaker with background noises. So I know we have a few people who still haven't muted. So if you could please do that, that would be great. When you do that, the audio is going to turn red. So if it's not red, if you hover over that and it's not red, then you want to click it one more time so it is red. Okay, sorry to interrupt again, Deborah. Thank you. Oops, you're muted.
Okay, I think.
I'll let Kevin get started now.
Oh, okay, I
Okay.
think we're good. Thank you, Deborah, for that introduction, and thank you, Tina, for that lovely bit of history. That was really nice. Appreciate that. I'm going to start and share my screen here if I can. Give me a second here. I'm having a little trouble. Yeah, I'm trying to get the. I got a thing I have to check with the sound. I want to make sure I have the right settings going. Oh, here it is. Sorry, I found it. There's a little button I have to push so that you can hear the sound of the birds that I play. I want to make sure you guys hear that. So I think we are getting there. All right, you guys see my slide there? All right. Well, thank you again for inviting me to give you a talk today. It's great to talk about my favorite group of birds here, and it's great to talk about the Audubon Society. I've been a member of the Audubon Society since I was like 6 years old as well, so it's been a lifelong organization of mine. And yeah, so I thought we'd take a trip south tonight and talk about what I think is one of the most spectacular groups of birds in the world, the tanagers. And tanagers are known for their vibrant, beautiful colors, as you can see in this slide. But as I'll talk about tonight, there's a lot more to tanagers than just their pretty colors. They vary a lot in beak size and shape, their habitats, behaviors, and many other characters. There's a lot of diversity in this group. But what exactly is a tanager? Well, that's a question that's puzzled ornithologists for decades. There's no single physical character that can define the group well. And when I started working on this group 35 years ago as a graduate student, I thought it'd be a great group to look at in terms of evolution, because that's another passion of mine, is looking at evolution of things. So how did they get these colors and bills? But I could have picked a better group to work on, because at the time, no one knew what the heck a tanager was. And so that was kind of a long challenge to try to figure that out. So we're interested in how all these colors evolve, how the species related to each other. But first we had to define a group and then build an evolutionary tree for all the species in order to answer those questions about color evolution and bill evolution and things like that. And along the way, there were a lot of surprises, things I wasn't expecting to find out. And those were kind of fun, and I'll share some of those with you tonight. And so I was thinking of things to talk about, and so I have four kind of subsets of my research on tanagers I'm going to talk about. First, we'll just talk about what is a tanager, and then I'm going to show you the tanager evolutionary tree, and then talk about some tanager characteristics. We're going to talk about their colors, their geography, where they live, what their habitats are, their vocalizations, and then bill size and shape. And then I'll talk about one study we did with some of my students looking at the evolution of song and the evolution of color in the group. And then we'll end by talking about what I'm saying is the newest tanager. This is a tanager that a species that we described to science for the first time just a couple years ago. So first off, let's talk about, I want to start by acknowledging like all the help I've had with all these studies. As I like to begin with that, because without all this help, none of this stuff would have been possible. First, I'm going to acknowledge all the different museums and various institutions that provided the tissues and genetic material needed for the evolution part of the project. And also specimens in those museums have been very important for studying coloration and morphology. It's impossible to kind of, as much as I'd like to, go in the field and see every single species in the field to study. You can't do that. There's too many, but the museums are a great repository for learning about these birds. Most of the funding for my work has come from the National Science Foundation and also from the National Geographic Society. And we've used the Cornell's Macaulay Library for songs, and that's been how we've been able to study all the vocalizations. And then I've had many talented graduate students and undergraduate students over the years that have helped me with different pieces of this project, and other collaborators. And then I've borrowed a lot of images in this talk, and I've tried to give credit to everybody there. So let's open up and start talking about what is a tanager. Let's tackle that big question. As I mentioned, ornithologists have been struggling with this question for decades. We can go way back to 1886, and the famous zoologist Philip Sclater wrote this: "And I do not think it is at present practicable to give any absolute characters which would serve to differentiate the tanagers." Fast forward 100 years to 1969, in this paper aptly named "What is a Tanager" by Bob Storr, he wrote pretty much the same thing. The tanagers are not a natural group, and a reappraisal of the whole nine-primate assemblage is needed before relationships of and with tanagers are understood. And that statement proved to be correct. Only by looking at all these other birds that are in this group called nine-primate Oscines was I finally able to solve this puzzle of what is a tanager. So what is a nine-primate Oscine? Well, these are birds familiar to North American bird watchers, most of them anyway. Oscine is just a fancy word for songbird, and nine-primate means they have nine prominent flight feathers. And so nine-primate Oscines includes birds like warblers, blackbirds, sparrows, cardinals and grosbeaks, and tanagers. And traditionally, birds have been divided into families in this group based on perceived importance of their feeding morphology. So birds that were colorful and fed on insects and picked them off of leaves were put with the warblers. Ground foraging insect eaters were often put with the blackbirds. Seed eaters with conical bills were put with the sparrows, and if they had a big bill and they ate seeds, they were put with cardinals and grosbeaks. And then kind of like colorful fruit-eating birds and anything kind of left over were just kind of shoved into the tanagers because they didn't know what else to do with them for the most part. And so that's kind of where traditional taxonomy was. And so I was interested in tanagers, but like I said, only by looking at all these other groups was able to solve the puzzle. And that's where collaboration was very important. So I collaborated with people working on warblers, blackbirds, sparrows, and cardinals and grosbeaks, and we combined all our data together into a big, massive data set of over 800 species. And so we have over 800 species, almost all blackbirds, warblers, tanagers, sparrows, grosbeaks, and cardinals. And we had to turn to genetics because the morphology wasn't able to solve the puzzle. And there's a lot of reasons for that I'll talk about in a minute, but we had to use the genes to help us. So we had 6 genes in this initial study that we looked at, and we used a variety of methods to build an evolutionary tree for all species. And I don't really want to go into the methods tonight, but basically what you're using the genetic data and you're using these models to figure out how mutations occur and accumulate across time in these species. And then you make a tree or a diagram showing how all the different species are related to each other. So in this very simple diagram, species 1 and 2 are more closely related to each other than they are to 3, and 1, 2, and 3 are more closely related to they are to 4. So the genetics gives you a key to sort of figuring that out. And so just think about upscaling this to 800 species, which is what we did, and built this giant tree. So what does a species of 800 what does a tree of 800 species look like? Well, it won't fit on all one slide, and I don't expect you to be able to read all these names. So this is just sort of a summary slide to sort of illustrate what we found. And 800 species is a lot. It's like 8% of all birds were included in this analysis. And let me show you where everything ended up in all these different groups. So first of all, the big group, that's my group, the tanagers. So that's the biggest group turned out to be tanagers. And then the closest group related to tanagers are the cardinals and grosbeaks. So that includes our black-headed grosbeak and lazuli bunting and things like that, as well as cardinals. And then here's where the blackbirds, warblers, and sparrows ended up. I should have told you too, to read these diagrams, this would be the oldest part of the tree over here, and then everything's sort of branching off from that point. So that's kind of the basic framework, but it's not that simple because there are a lot of birds. I don't know how well you can see, but there's some birds that don't really fit into those groups. They're in these little areas of black in here. And so those species that didn't fit in, we had to revise the taxonomy and come up with new families. We now have like 16 families in this group from the original 5. And so we have these new families that we constructed. And also we found out that a lot of birds that were classified with tanagers fell out in other parts of the tree. So they're no longer tanagers. And then we found that a lot of birds that that weren't tanagers showed up in the tanager part of the tree. So a lot of shuffling back and forth of things that are and aren't tanagers. And so things were kind of a mess, but I think we finally, after all this time, have it straightened out. And so what I want to do now is kind of tell you like some of the findings of who's in and who's out. You know, what do we find that wasn't a tanager, and what do we find that is a tanager? So first of all, who's out? Well, there are these little tiny stocky songbirds called chlorophonias and euphonias from Central and South America, and they have really modified digestive systems for processing mistletoes. And so they eat mistletoe berries, digest it, and disperse mistletoe. That's one of the things they're known for, plus their bright colors. It turns out these aren't even in that non-primate group at all. These are more closely related to goldfinches. So these were once thought to be tanagers, and now they're pretty distantly related. So those guys are not in tanagers anymore. And then there's a whole bunch of tanagers that turn out to be entirely new families, like this rosy thrush tanager, the spindalis tanagers from the Caribbean islands. The Puerto Rican tanager is an endemic bird to the island of Puerto Rico. Chat tanagers are on Hispaniola, and so is the palm tanagers. So all of these birds are actually a new family. So this Puerto Rican tanager was thought to be just another species of tanager. Now it's like this endemic family of birds only found on Puerto Rico, which is pretty cool. And then also there's a group of birds called bush tanagers, which aren't tanagers either. There's about 11 of these, and they turn out to be sparrows. These are a little bit more drab colored than a lot of the traditional tanagers, and they kind of fit pretty well with the sparrows, except the bills don't look like your typical sparrow bill. And then there are a bunch of these sort of more colorful birds that are called tanagers, things like ant tanagers, that turn out to belong to cardinals and grosbeaks. And then, as Deborah was saying, I had another surprise. Perhaps one of the findings that's gotten the most attention, or maybe even controversial with some people, at least North American bird watchers, and that's that species in the genus Paranga are not tanagers. They actually fall into the cardinal and grosbeak family. And this genus includes the 4 species of tanagers that regularly breed in North America: the western tanager, the summer tanager, scarlet tanager, and hepatic tanager. So those birds, even though they're called tanagers, they are no longer in the tanager family. They're in with the cardinals and grosbeaks. Now we get western tanagers here during migration, and they actually nest up in our mountains. We're the southern tip of their distribution here in San Diego, where they breed. And then summer tanagers, we can get those nesting in the Ansberger Desert. So these birds are no longer tanagers. So if the only tanager you've ever seen is one of these, I hate to be the one to tell you that you haven't seen a tanager. However, since we live in San Diego, all you have to do is go to Balboa Park, and you can see all the tanagers you want. In the so-called hummingbird aviary at the San Diego Zoo, they have a lot of these birds there. In fact, all of these pictures were taken in the hummingbird aviary at the zoo. I call it the so-called hummingbird aviary because there's usually only like 1 or 2 hummingbirds in there, because hummingbirds are pretty territorial, and so I don't think they like to tolerate each other. And so, but there's plenty of tanagers in there. These bright little jewel-colored birds flitting around. And so if you want to see some tanagers, just head over to the zoo, and they have lots of them in the collection. It's pretty awesome. Okay, so I told you who's out, what's not a tanager anymore. So what birds stayed? Well, about 180 species were traditionally considered tanagers, and they're still tanagers. About 3/4 of the birds previously classified as tanagers are still tanagers, and those are illustrated in this slide. Many of the colorful species from Central and South America are still considered tanagers. And then one of the other big surprises is about 171 species of neotropical sparrows and finches aren't sparrows, and they're not finches at all. They turn out to be tanagers. And this includes things like the Sierra finch on the left, these yellow finches in the middle here. There's a whole group of these in the genus Cycalus. This is the saffron finch. And then a huge surprise here was the Darwin's finches, the very famous Darwin's finches. No, there's like 18 species of these. They're known for their adaptive radiation on the Galapagos Island. Turns out they're not finches at all. They actually belong in the tanager family. And we were able to use that information to kind of look at the origin of Darwin's finches. And it turns out that Darwin's finches are actually pretty closely related to a lot of Caribbean species. And so we think that the Darwin's finches may have possibly had an origin from a Caribbean bird rather than one from South America. So that was pretty interesting. So these were all added to the tanagers. And then some of the grosbeaks and cardinals, I told you some of the tanagers are no longer in the tanager group, but they're now grosbeaks and cardinals, but it went the other way around. Some of the cardinals turn out to be tanagers, including 16 species of these big-billed birds called saltators, and the yellow-shouldered grosbeak and the bluefinch. These all moved from the cardinal family to the tanager family. And then some birds called conebills were long classified with the warblers, but now they're in the tanager group. So where does that leave us? Well, I know it's like in the evening and everyone's already done their taxes, so maybe you don't want to do any more math, but we'll just keep it simple, do some tanager math and see where we've ended up with. We started with 242 species. If we go back to Bob Storr, the one that wrote that paper, What is a Tanager? That traditional classification from the 70s and kind of where we were at when I started this work in the 90s was 242 species. And 62 of those species turn out not to be tanagers, so that leaves us with 180. But 204 that weren't with the tanagers now are tanagers. So now we have 384 species in this group of tanagers, which is pretty huge for a single family of birds. In fact, it's the largest family of songbirds. There's all these other groups that are better known, like hummingbirds and parrots and woodpeckers, but they have fewer species than the tanagers. So I'm hoping that now that we have a good idea of what species belong in the tanagers, we can promote their study even more, because I think a lot of people have been reluctant to study them because it was hard to know kind of really what's in the group. And so I've seen that since we've published a tree, more and more people are working on questions about tanagers. And so just to kind of review the old view and the new view, the old view, we had 242 species and 59 genera. Now we have 384 species and 107 genera, and they were originally thought to be North, Central, and South America, but as I told you, the ones, the Western and Scarlet, those ones in that genus Paranga are no longer considered tanagers, so now it's just restricted to Mexico, Central, and South America. And then traditionally, they're thought to be mostly fruit eaters, but now we know they eat a lot of different kinds of things. And as I'll show you, they were traditionally thought to be only colorful, but now they have all these different colors in them, not just the bright ones, but also some dull, drab ones. I should say, too, that shuffling things all around kind of makes a messy situation with the common names, because now we have all these birds that are called tanagers that aren't tanagers and vice versa. And so that creates a problem. There's about 100 species of tanagers that have finches in their names, and there's about 40 birds that have tanagers in their names that are no longer tanagers. So if we wanted to change all those names, it would be a lot of change for people to kind of get used to. But I would like to argue that maybe at least for Paranga, the ones in the genus Paranga, like the Western tanager, scarlet tanager, and summer tanager, hepatic tanager, the ones we have in North America, it would be nice to change their name. And I think we should change it maybe to the genus name, because the genus name is Paranga, and that's an indigenous word for these birds. And so I think it'd be cool to have Western Paranga, summer Paranga, scarlet Paranga, and so forth. But that's a conversation for another day, I think. Okay, so I've told you what is a tanager. Now let's look at that tree in a little bit more detail, at least talk about some aspects of the tree, and then we'll talk about some of their characteristics. And so this is kind of a weird looking tree because it's shaped like a circle, and that's just so it can fit onto the slide. So the root of the tree is here in the middle, and then we have all these branches coming off, and there's an early burst of speciation at the beginning. So there's lots of diversity in colors, beaks, ecology, and behavior on this tree. And you'll see there's different colors as you go around, and that's because we've made subfamilies so we could sort of get a grip on all this diversity to organize that diversity a little bit better. In terms of age, you can actually use the genetic data and do some models about rates of mutation to figure out how old the group is. So it's about 12 million years old. which, that's old to us, but it's actually not geologically that old. It's actually pretty recent, especially for a group with this many species. In fact, when we look at that, evolving 384 species in 12 million years, that's a fast rate of speciation. In fact, the speciation rate in tanagers is 40% higher than their relatives like warblers and blackbirds and sparrows. And it's an order of magnitude greater than vertebrates as a whole. So it's one of the fastest rates of speciation in all the vertebrates. And that was completely not appreciated until we had that genetic data to look at that. And all of these beaks and all of this color and everything has evolved in this short amount of time. And that's why I call it like a burst of beaks and colors, all in this one group, all in this one group. Okay, so now that I've told you kind of or at least summarized kind of all the different kinds of birds that are in the tanager, we have this new view of tanagers. Let's go over, the different characteristics of tanagers under this new umbrella, new idea of tanagers. And first of all, let's get back to the color. The whole color palette is present in tanagers. And some of the colors are laid down in these really crazy quilt-like patterns, including this one here. This is my favorite tanager for obvious reasons. The paradise tanager, pretty good name for that bird. This apple green head, violet throat, turquoise belly, black back, and red rump. The paradise tanager is found in the Amazon basin. Another one with lots of patterns is this aptly named multicolored tanager. But literally every color of the rainbow is in tanagers: reds, oranges, yellows, greens, blues, and violets. That whole range. Greens, blues, and violets. But even it's beyond that. So even beyond violets into the ultraviolet. And so what I mean by that is that birds can see into part of the electromagnetic spectrum that humans can't see. And that's because birds have 4 photoreceptor proteins in their eyes compared to the 3 that humans have. And one of those photoreceptors can see into the ultraviolet. And so they can see ultraviolet colors. We can't see these colors, of course, but we can quantify them using an instrument called a spectrophotometer. So we've done that with all the tanagers. We've measured them all to see if they have ultraviolet coloration. And we found that 48% of tanagers have at least one plumage patch that reflects significant amount of ultraviolet coloration. So this is coloration that we can't see. And we've done a lot of studies on that, but I just want to talk about a couple neat findings we found looking at that ultraviolet coloration in tanagers. And here's one of the birds that I want to talk about. It's called the palm tanager. It's one of the more common tanagers that you could find on a trip to South America. They come to feeding tables all the time. They're in parks and people's backyards and things like that. And if we look at that bird and with our human eyes, we'd say, okay, that's a nice looking bird, but it's kind of a dull green olive. It's not very brightly colored. But when we measured it with our instrument, what we found is on the left here. What we're looking at is this is the wavelength that might be reflected, and then this is the level of reflectance on this axis, the x-axis here. And then this line with the red dots, that shows you the percent reflectance. And so there's a huge percent reflectance in the UV part of the range. In the human part of the range, it's not very impressive. And so that's why this is sort of interpreted as this kind of a green olive color. But this huge peak in the UV tells us that the birds must see some dramatic coloration that we don't see. And so this is kind of a way that a whole different sensory environment for the birds. This is a brightly colored bird to other birds. So that was one cool thing I wanted to share with you. Another one is this bird, which is aptly named by a human, obviously, glistening green tanager, because it is. It's sort of this bright green, shiny bird. And that's kind of what we see when we look at it as humans. But if you look closely, there's these little gray patches. There's one on the side, and there's one here by the ear, and one underneath the eye. And when I measured that with the instrument, I also found a huge peak in the ultraviolet range. Here, all of this, our brain interprets as this pattern here as sort of silver or gray. So that's not a very kind of bright, vibrant color. Just all these combined at this low rate of reflectance, like 10, 15%. But then there's this huge peak here. So the birds are seeing something different than we're seeing. We're seeing gray and silver, but the birds are seeing dramatic ultraviolet coloration. Now, we don't have bird vision, so we can't see what that really looks like. But we can kind of try to get an idea with photography. And so let me show you using this museum specimen of this bird from the museum in New York City, the American Museum of Natural History. And this is a study done by Bailey McKay. If you photograph it under normal light conditions, this is what the bird looks like. But if you filter out everything but UV reflectance, this is what it looks like. And so we have these bright spots where that silver or gray patches are. I'm going to show you back to here again, and then we'll move back to the one where we filtered out the UV light. And so those really kind of stand out as little like flashlights going on. So that just shows you kind of the birds are seeing different things than we can see. Okay, so we have all these colors, and we even have UV colors, but you know what? A lot of them are very cryptically colored. They have more drab plumage, and these little gray birds are probably not as well appreciated by bird watchers as much as all the brightly colored ones, but they're an important part of the color diversity of tanagers. So just expanding the palette into more different colors. And I should also say that a lot of tanagers are sexually dichromatic with colorful males and less colorful females, and some of these fit into that category as well. Okay, so that's a bit more about tanager colors. Let's talk about where tanagers live. And so in our new view of tanagers, they can be thought of as an endemic neotropical radiation. So they're really only found from Mexico south to the tip of South America. You do find them here in the Galapagos, like I said, the Darwin's finches, islands in the Caribbean, and then there's a few that made it out to these islands in the South Atlantic, and that's a whole nother story. Basically halfway between South America and Africa, there are a couple birds that made it out there. This diagram shows you not only where tanagers live, but also their densities. And the warmer colors are more diverse. They have more species there. So red up here would be 70. So up to 70 species can be found together in the Andes, in the central Andes in particular. That's what this strip is here. There's also lots of them here in northern South America. Northern South America, south of the Amazon here, and then over here in southeastern Brazil. Those are the highest density points for tanagers. There's one species that does creep up into Texas a little bit, and then there's some that show up in Florida from time to time, but for the most part, we don't see them in the United States. Because tanagers are found all over these different regions, they're found in all these different habitats. In fact, tanagers have been found in 27 of the 29 terrestrial habitats identified for Central and South America have tanagers in them. And these are some of those. They have dense tropical rainforest, and here in the high altitude grasslands, and then also in some scrublands. You can find them in grasslands, the Pantanal wetlands, also some wooded scrub habitats. Polylepis woodland is a specialized habitat in high elevations, cloud forest, and also second growth. So you really can find tanagers in just about every single terrestrial habitat that you might encounter Mexico, Central, or South America. Okay, so tanagers, when people think about them, they think of their stunning in appearance, but they're poor singers. Well, that's not totally true. There's lots of tanagers that have really great songs and interesting songs, and I'm gonna play a few of these for you, so hopefully you can appreciate some of that diversity, and I'm thinking this is gonna work. First of all, these diagrams are called spectrograms, and they're showing you the notes. The dark points are the notes. The x-axis here is time, and the y-axis is the frequency. So you can kind of follow along if you want. First, I'm going to play you this one. It's very quiet. It's hard to hear. This is the chestnut-backed tanager. I have its scientific name there, Tanagera preciosa. And it's a pretty thin, hard to hear song. So that's kind of what people think of when they think of tanagers as something not very impressive. But some of them are more melodious, like this one. This one's called the red-capped cardinal. So that's a prettier song. This one here, the blue-backed hornbill, has a lot of quick delivery and twittering and rapid changes in frequency. That's really a complex vocalization. It's hard for a bird to produce that. This one has some trills. This one's nasally with some harmonics. And this is the large ground finch, one of the Darwin's finches, with some repeated vocalizations. So I just wanted to give you a flavor of the variety of vocalizations that tanagers can produce. So we're going to come back to song in a little bit here. And then, of course, as I mentioned, there's all these different diversity of beak sizes and shapes in tanagers. There's thick-billed seed eaters, thin-billed nectar feeders like this bird here. There's aerial insect foragers, there's foliage gleaners, fruit eaters, and this diversity of feeding types is what you might see in an island radiation, but in tanagers, it's really occurred on a continental scale. I don't have time to talk about all of these different foraging adaptations, but I want to talk about one. This is a flower piercer here, and you notice it has a little hook on the end of its bill. And this is a giant photograph of a museum specimen one, so you can see that hook. And here's one, you might see the hook of this living one here. And that hook is used for a very specialized way of feeding. These are nectar feeders. They do eat some fruit, but they also eat nectar. And they have a unique way of getting that nectar. They can get nectar from really large flowers using a specific technique that involves this hook. So this is a huge flower. This is the corolla here. And typically a bird's going to come in through this end of the flower and get some nectar, and in the process get pollen all over its face, then go visit another flower and pollinate that flower. But not the flower piercers. They use that hook to hold the base of the corolla of the flower, and then they pierce it with their lower mandible, and then they stick their tongue in that hole and then drink out the nectar. So in that way, they're able to get the nectar from these large flowers they otherwise would not have access to. And in the process, they don't actually pollinate the flower very much. And so sometimes they're called nectar robbers or nectar thieves because of that behavior. Okay, so that's a little bit about tanager characters, their colors, their songs, their habitat preferences, their bills. I want to talk now about song and color in a little bit more detail and talk about one of the studies we did in my lab looking at the evolution of these traits. And these two traits, there's a rich history of studying song and plumage kind of independently, but they haven't really been studied together at the same time. And that's something we wanted to look at with the tanagers. We wanted to test this long-standing hypothesis called the transfer hypothesis. And the idea here is that color and song, complex color and complex song might evolve independently. There's some anecdotal evidence for this. You can go back to Charles Darwin, in fact, and he said this kind of thing, like bright colors and the power of song seem to replace each other. So in other words, if you see a brightly colored bird, it's not going to have a very elaborate song. And if you hear a very elaborate song, it's going to be a dull colored bird. The idea is that evolution is going to target one or the other and not both simultaneously. And so birds with complex songs should have dry plumage, and birds with elaborate plumage should have simple songs. So we thought, well, if we should test this with tanagers since it's the largest family of songbirds. Just an example of where, just anecdotally looking around and seeing what this transfer hypothesis looks like. So we would see, like, for example, the cardinal. It's a very colorful bird. And so its song, though, I'm going to play it here. It's actually pretty simple. Although it sounds pleasing to us, it's not a very complex song for a bird to produce. Now contrast that with the house wren, which we have around here. All right, it's just another little brown bird, right? But if you listen to its song, it's a very complicated song for a bird to produce. There's lots of changes in frequency quickly, and it's actually a fairly long song, and so that would be a complex vocalization. So we set out to test this. This is just like looking at individual birds, but you really need a comprehensive quantitative study to kind of answer this question. And so that's what we did with tanagers. I had a student named Allison Schultz working on plumage color and another student named Nick Mason working on song. And so they decided to put all their data together and see what we could find. Allison's now the curator of birds at the Natural History Museum in LA County, and Nick is now a professor at LSU. And so Allison used that spectrophotometer to measure all the tanagers and had all these different measurements from the tanagers. And she came up with an index of plumage color complexity. And then Nick measured all the songs of tanagers and came up with a measure of song complexity. And so we decided to look at that, the plumage complexity and song complexity, to see if they were negatively correlated. Now, one kind of, this is kind of what we do in science sometimes. We take all this beautiful nature and we turn it into numbers. But that's kind of what you have to do if you want to study something and test the hypothesis. And one kind of interesting side effect of this is now we can rank all the tanagers from the most complex and colorful to the least, and we can rank all the songs too. So just for fun, I wanted to see what was the #1 most complex plumaged bird, and it turns out to be my favorite one, the paradise tanager with all those different colors on it. And here's the other top 5 here showing you some of the more complex plumage birds. And I was glad to see the glistening green tanager in this group because it's the one that had those little UV patches, and so it shows up in that group as well. So I was happy to see that. Here's the sort of simplest plumage or the least complex, the ones that don't really have complex plumage. And as you can see, they're all pretty uniform in coloration. And so we rank them all in terms of color complexity. Song complexity, the most complex is this chestnut-bellied flower piercer. And it's pretty soft, so you may not hear it very well, but there's a lot of changes in frequency, and it's really long. The song just keeps going and going and going. And so that was the winner of the song complexity contest. It just goes, it's over a minute long here. Cut is. And then here's the simplest one. These are the 10 simplest, the song losers, if you will. This is the white-bellied seed eater. That's about it. That's all it got. That's all it has. Okay, so back to our question. We're testing this transfer hypothesis. We want to see, this is what we would expect if the transfer hypothesis is true, that birds, this is the color complexity scale. Birds that are very colorful, they should be lousy singers, so they'd be lousy here. And birds that have very simple plumage, they should be great singers. They should fit in over here. And then we have this negative trend line. Let's see what we found. We didn't find that. We found this big mess, all these points all over the place. And we thought, well, maybe it's some of the subfamilies might show that trend. And so that's what the different colors are, is testing each subfamily. And 2 of them did show that, but they don't have very many species in it. The red one here has 4, and this green one has 9. So really, we have no support for the transfer hypothesis. There's some birds over here that are both colorful and great singers, and we have some birds over here that are neither. They don't have either of them, and there's a bunch in the middle. And so I think this is pretty good evidence that this transfer hypothesis is not going to hold up when it's tested across birds, because this is, as I said, the largest group of songbirds. Okay, I have one more topic I want to talk to you about tonight, and this is what I'm calling the newest tanager. So this is a species we recently described for science, and that bird is now known as the Inti tanager, And we described this, the official description was published in October of 2021. And as you can see on the bottom, I'm just one team of a group of authors. Myself and some of my students were involved in this. And our contribution was doing the genetics to try to figure out what this beast was, because when it was first found, it was unclear what it was. And I want to first make sure I clarify, I want to talk about the word discovery here, because it's incorrect to say that we discovered this bird, because we don't know what past peoples in the area may have knew about this bird, and even though the area today where it lives is pretty sparsely populated, we don't know whether other, current humans had seen the birds in the past. So I don't like saying that we discovered this bird, but we did describe it for science, and so that's the best way of talking about this. And new species are described all the time, but not very often in birds. But this was something really different. Usually, when something's described, a bird anyway, because we know bird species level stuff pretty well. Usually it's something that has a close relative, or it's a genetic difference that makes it distinct or something like that. But this is a really radically different bird from anything else. In fact, we ended up not just naming it as a new species, but we gave it its own genus. And I'll tell you why in a minute. And the whole story of finding the bird is a pretty cool story. It took over 20 years from the time it was first seen until its official description was published in 2021. So it's something else I want to talk about. This painting is called The Tree of Life. It's by Charlie Harper. It's one of my favorite artists. And I really like this painting because it shows how much wonderful biodiversity we have on this planet to celebrate. And as much as we know about biodiversity, there's so much that we still don't know. In reality, much of the Earth's biodiversity, many of the species aren't described by science yet, especially some of the smaller life forms. In fact, we don't even know how many species there are on the planet. There's about 2 million species described, but the estimated number out there is anywhere from 3 to 100 million species. 3 to 100 million. A good consensus, though, is about 8.7 million. So only about 2 million of those 8.7 millions have been described to science. And unfortunately, as you know, we're in the middle of an extinction crisis, the proportion of which we haven't seen since geological time. And each of those species out there, the described ones and the undescribed ones, have a story to tell. And so since so few species are described, we're actually losing species before we can read those stories and learn those stories. And those stories have things that might help us provide solutions to some human problems. So an analogy here that I like is that what we're doing is we're burning down the library before we've read all the books. The species are the books, and they have the stories to tell us. They have the stories to tell us. And reading those stories and describing that biodiversity is important. We could think of just maybe practical applied reasons. So each of these species has been evolving for millions of years and solving problems that have potential human applications. And just a simple example here, this is a gecko, and geckos, of course, are known for clinging to horizontal surfaces, even upside down. And scientists are studying that process to try to figure out reusable adhesives. So some applied ways of using that. Also, many species have potentially useful chemical compounds that could be used by humans for medicine, industry, research. For example, aspirin comes from willow trees. Penicillin, an important antibiotic, has come from fungus. And even something that may seem harmful, like bushmaster venom, has been found to lower blood pressure. There's all sorts of medicines that can be derived from different kinds of species. And of course, describing biodiversity is important for keeping ecosystems functioning. Keeping ecosystems functioning. It's important for conservation biology. To keep ecosystems functioning, we need to know all the species and what they do. We need to know who all the players are. There's another analogy here I want to reference, and it comes from a biologist named David Hillis. And he says that because all the species haven't been described, conservation biologists are like car mechanics that are trying to keep a car running, but they only know a small percentage of the engine parts. And those engine parts are falling off as they're trying to fix the car and keep it going. So we don't know all the players in these ecosystems and what their role is, and how can we keep these ecosystems going. And so that's why describing new biodiversity is important. Okay, well, speaking of ecosystems, this photograph is the ecosystem where this species was first spotted. And this is where our story begins. The bird was first found on this road, which is called, I don't know if you can see cutting through the hillside there, there's a road. This is called the Manu Road, and it's in Peru. And it's an access road that it connects Cusco up in the high Andes down all the way into the Amazon. It's a very long road. And along that road, 1,000 different species of birds have been spotted, which is pretty incredible. That's 10% of all the world's birds have been spotted on this road. So this road is a pretty popular road for bird watchers. And in fact, two biologists, Dan Lane and Gary Rosenberg, were leading a birding tour along this road in October of 2000. And on this road, they spotted this bird. Well, first they heard an unfamiliar song that they didn't recognize. And these two are experts in birds of South America. And so they knew right away it was just a weird sound, something they hadn't heard before. And so they heard this sound. And then all of a sudden, this bird flies up out of the vegetation and lands on top of a dead snag. And it kind of didn't compute in their brains because it was a very different looking bird, this yellow canary colored bird with this pinkish bill and a black line over the eye. It didn't look like anything else that they knew about. And they know all the species that are down there. And it was a really surprising thing to them. But only Dan and Gary saw it. Nobody else in the group saw it because the bird quickly, as birds often do, quickly flew over the ridge and vanished, not to be seen again. So Gary got a quick 9-second recording of the song, and Dan's an artist, and he made a quick sketch, and that's his sketch. And so that's all they had at that point. And subsequent attempts to find the bird again at the same spot, both with and without tour groups, proved fruitless. They didn't see it again until 2003. And so 3 years went by. Finally, in 2003, at the same spot, leading a tour again, they heard it again. This time they got a good recording, and they played the recording back. And then the bird came into the recording and popped up and gave everyone a good view. And so now they had a better view of the bird. But they didn't get a good photo at that point. But then eventually a year later, I think it was, they got another good photo. So that's good. They've got a photo of the bird, they've got a recording of the bird, but that's not enough to really describe a species. You need more tangible documentation, not just a sketch or even a photograph. So to have a formal description of the bird, you need more tangible evidence. You need to know more about its ecology and natural history and things like that would be important too. And so that was in 2003, and they really didn't get good looks at the bird again for a long time. And then a breakthrough came in 2011, so many years later, when another researcher was working in a different area in Bolivia. So here's where the bird was originally found, this first arrow. And then this other researcher named Frank Wright was doing work in Bolivia. And at this site, he found a large breeding population of this species and a completely different kind of habitat too, in deciduous forest. Now, there'd been a couple ornithological expeditions to that region before, but it was during the dry season and the bird wasn't there. But Frank was there during the wet season. And it's also a very remote area. My understanding, it's like a 22-hour bus ride from La Paz here to get to the nearest village. And then it's an hours-long hike through some rough terrain to get to the spot where you can see the birds in their breeding grounds. So that was 2011, and so that was very exciting. And so in 2012, they went back and did an expedition there, 2013 and 2019. And then they did all these detailed studies and were able to get information about the natural history, ecology, information on the breeding, and then samples for genetic analysis, which is kind of where I came in. And one of the things they figured out is that the bird was migratory. It's migrating between these two regions, which is really, really weird because most birds, as you know, they migrate from the tropics to the temperate zone every year. But this is a bird that migrates within the tropics. It's an intertropical migrant. And also, it's a bird that migrates up and down elevation. So it's spending its breeding rainy season down here in Bolivia. And then in the non-breeding season, we think it's a lot more widespread, which explains why it was hard to find on that road because the bird's much more spread out during the dry season, non-breeding season. It's packed into territories. It's a smaller distribution during the breeding season. Okay, so they knew now they have a new something that hasn't been described as science before. So, you know, what is it? They weren't even sure what family it was at first. In fact, one kind of bird that came to mind was one of these orioles from Africa. And you can see why, because it's yellow and it's got this black eye line and this bill that's similarly colored to the bird that they found. But that didn't seem very plausible because how would one species from this African old world family show up in South America? So eventually, because that didn't seem practical, they sort of focused on tanagers because it was becoming known that tanagers was a very diverse group. And so it might make sense that it's just another form of tanager. And so that's where I came in. They sent me samples and to try to figure out what kind of bird this was. Is it a tanager or not? And if it is a tanager, what kind of tanager it is? And so we put DNA on the case of this mystery bird. And I had two students involved in this. Luke Klicka worked on this in 2014. He looked at 4 genes and tried to solve the puzzle, and he made progress and found some things out. And then even within 5 years, the technology changed a lot. So Rosalind Price Waldman came in and did almost 5,000 genes and really kind of solved the puzzle of where this bird fits in completely. So Luke is now a professor at Kansas, and Rosalind just finished her PhD at Princeton. So I want to give them a little shout out. And so what do we find out? Yes, the bird is a tanager. It is a tanager, and it belongs in this group of tanagers, or the subfamily of tanagers that we're calling the ornamented tanagers. And we're calling them the ornamented tanagers because they have little ornaments like bright colors, shiny beaks like this one, or a little rump patch, and especially crests. Lots of them have crests. And guess who else has a crest? Our Inti tanager has a crest. As you can see here, the male has this nice orange crest, so he fits in. Another similarity between these and the other birds in this subfamily is that it's sexually dichromatic with a colorful male and a drab-colored female. So the Inti tanager, the female looks like this in this painting done by Dan Lane, and the male looks like this. And so the birds in this group are also, most of them, sexually dichromatic as well. So that also made sense. So within that subfamily, who's its closest relative? Well, Luke was able to narrow it down to these two. It was the gray-headed tanager versus the black-goggled tanager. One of those two is likely the closest living relative. And then when Rosalind had to look at 5,000 genes to really drill down and figure out where it is. And it turns out it's just barely more closely related to this one, the black-goggled, than it is to this one here, the gray-headed tanager. And as you can see, the branch length connecting here is pretty short. And so we think it's almost a simultaneous speciation event, perhaps, between these three species. And one thing you'll notice is that these two, this is a scientific name for both of these. The first one is the genus name. And so each of these is in its own genus. And so we had a couple options here. We could have put this into Trichothraupis, but since that branch is so short and this has its own genus, we thought it's better to put it in its own genus. Plus, there's other reasons too. The unusual color of this bird, the different kind of song it has. Its song is very different from the other tanagers. Both males and females sing in this new species. They have territorial behavior, that weird intra-elevational, intratropical migration behavior. So lots of unusual characters. Also, this node is about 5 million years old, the bird itself. And so it's pretty deep into the tree. And so all of those things are pointing to something that deserves not just a new species name, but also a new genus name. So we gave it a new genus name. What did we call it? We decided to call it Heliothraupis. Heliothraupis translates into sun tanager. So its official scientific name is Heliothraupis o'neillii. Heliothraupis meaning sun tanager. And O'Neillii is named in honor of an ornithologist that's done a lot to promote ornithology in Peru, John O'Neill. And then for the common name is Inti tanager. Inti tanager. We could have named it the sun tanager, but Dan wanted to try to honor the traditional cultures of the area by using the word Inti, which means sun in Quechua and Amaya languages, a language traditionally spoken in the region. We know of no known existing native or local names, so we thought that would be a good name to call it Inti tanager, and so that's why it has that. That's why it has that name. So I thought I would kind of like maybe end this talk about the Inti tanager with a little video and a song of it. So you could see the bird in action. Some good news is that it's kind of almost surprising. This species is currently not considered endangered. It's classified as least concern by the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, although and much of the distribution is in a national park. But however, based on some surveys, there are some calls to reclassify it as threatened due to potential threats from deforestation and gold mining in the area. So I just thought I would end by summing up some of the big take-home messages from this talk. Based on our analyses, we've rearranged the tanager family into something that's pretty different than what people thought before. And we now know that tanagers are very diverse. That's my Plumage, Panorama, and Beak Bonanza, if you will humor me with that funny title of what's going on with the tanagers. So much speciation in so little time, and it's just exploded in terms of its diversity in colors and diversity in beak sizes. A remarkable rate of speciation, much higher than the relative rate of vertebrates as a whole. And then we also showed that song and plumage can evolve independently. Some birds can have it all. They can be brightly colored and be great singers. And some birds, maybe not so much, everything in between. So we can have all those things happening. And also just another point that there's lots of biodiversity is unknown to science. And we have one little small contribution to that, this new tanager, the Inti tanager. And, we need more biodiversity scientists to get out there and look at all this. Again, thank you so much for letting me talk to you about my favorite group of birds tonight. And I appreciate you guys very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. That was just fascinating. I'm wondering, we may have people that have other questions, but if we wanted to read more, learn more about tanagers, where would you send us?
Well, the last book written on tanagers is from the 80s, and so it's missing a lot of the species, but it's still a good book. It's by the Eislers, Eisler and Eisler, and you can find it in used bookstores, but maybe the best, so it's right there. But right now the best place would be like Birds of the World online, which is run by Cornell. They have they have the classification all correct based on our tree, and they have all the birds on there, and you can read biology of them. Me and my students have written, I think, like 60 of the accounts for Cornell. And I'm working on a book now, if I could ever find the time. So I'm writing a book for Cornell Press on tanagers, and I'm probably going to.
I thought you might be. That's why I asked the question.
Give me another 3 years or so.
Yes.
To be done. I think I have to retire first to get enough time to do it.
Yeah. Margaret, did you have a question?
Yeah, a couple of questions really. When you discover a new species like that, do you have to collect it, like kill it? And then is there a way to get the DNA, without collecting it?
You can get DNA without collecting it. You take a blood sample, but sort of the standard in science is to collect at least one specimen. And of course, we only want to collect it if there's enough birds to that you're not going to hurt the population, right? And so it's important to have a reference for perpetuity put into a museum that other people can study and really compare to other birds to confirm all the differences. And so we can do studies where we can measure it later and things like that. So they did end up collecting a few individuals. Of course, they had all the proper permits and everything to do that from the governments, and they had to be able to show that it's a common bird, enough bird to do that.
And Patty, do you have a question?
I do. Yeah, I also have a couple. So one is you said that much of their distribution is in a national park. Is it that their breeding distribution in, I think it was Bolivia?
Yeah, yeah, breeding distribution. I think part of the non-breeding distribution as well is in a national park, but the breeding distribution I think is protected. That's my understanding.
Okay. And then my other one is a little off, but I've always been curious about the sexually monochromatic species and whether or not you can use, if there are studies to use the camera or whatever the instrument was to find out if in fact they differ in the UV spectrum, that the other, the opposite sex is seeing something different.
Yeah, that's a great question. In fact, that's something else that we looked at. We've measured them all and calculated whether they're sexually dichromatic. If you just thumb through a book and look at all the pictures, a human would tell you half of them are dichromatic and half of them are monochromatic. And in tanagers, you have a lot of them that are really brightly colored, and the male and female looks the same. But with the instrument, only like two or three are monochromatic, truly. All of the others are differ between males and females. So the birds can sex each other, but the humans can't, which I guess it's more important for the birds to be able to do it, but the humans can't. And it's not just UV, they also have better ability to discriminate colors than humans do. So they can tell different shades of blue better than we can.
That's great.
So
Yeah,
having that instrument's eye-opening.
I always wondered about California condors because we would take blood samples to find out the difference in sexes so that we would know.
Oh yeah.
So they would know they were putting males and females together rather than
Yeah, that's important.
breeding,
Yeah.
situation. So, well, thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. Great question.
Margaret, did you get both of your questions in?
Yes, I did. Thank
Okay,
you.
great. Anybody else have any questions? We could probably talk about this all night. It's so incredible that this species is just unbelievable to me. All of the different species, I guess, with the different colorations. It's amazing.
Oh,
Are
yeah.
there places where there are a lot of tanagers in the United States in captivity, or like at a zoo, or?
Oh, I think San Diego might have the biggest collection. Honestly, you can see them in the hummingbird aviary, also the safari park in their hidden jungle has a bunch in there as well. I don't think I've been to another zoo that has more. Maybe the aviary in Pittsburgh, the National Aviary in Pittsburgh, might have more. I think it's been a while since I've been there. Yeah. So, yeah,
Definitely worth the visit.
Oh yeah, or just take a trip to Ecuador or Costa Rica, or
Unfortunately, I was in Peru, but it was before I was looking at birds. So
well, you got to go back.
all of that.
Gotta
I'll
go
have
back.
to go back.
Yeah, yeah. So I think June has a question. I see a hand raised.
Oh, yes, June.
Hi, Dr. Burns. I do have a question. It's about the naming convention, or at least for the common names. Since now we know that there are tanagers that weren't considered tanagers before, and also birds that were considered tanagers but are no longer.
Yes.
I'm wondering how that's going to change the naming convention. Like for the Western tanager in California, will it be the Western yellow mountain bird?
Well, yeah, so that it would take like proposals to change the names, and some of the names have been changed for some of the birds. Um, but people don't like change, and so um, we'd have to really think about that because there's probably like 100 and something birds that would need their name changed. But I think a strong argument I would like to make and would be to change the Western tanager to Western paranga because the genus name is paranga, and paranga is a native word for these birds, and so I think that would be an easy change to make for the ones that we have in North America, at least, hepatic paranga, scarlet paranga, and it's an easy word to say. It's not complicated or anything, and I think people will be supportive. And I just like true. Well, I mean, I sit on the committee that makes those decisions, and so I think just maybe if I put a proposal in, we could sort of argue to get that changed, but we'll have to see.
That would be great to learn more about.
Yeah, yeah, but people are very resistant. They don't like to learn new names, so there's a lot of controversy about names right now.
Oh yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thanks for the question.
Well, if there's no other questions, we will wrap it up. And I see lots of appreciation and love going to you, Kevin. So
Oh, well, thank you
people
guys.
really enjoyed.
I'm glad. Thanks for staying awake.
Oh, it was fascinating. I mean, how can you sleep with all those colors?
I know. I know. I just love them. All right.
And next month in May, on May 15th, we have one of your colleagues, um, whose name is Kinsey Brock is going to be speaking.
Yeah, she's
So,
awesome. Yeah, she's going to give a
Are
great
you
talk.
done down here?
I'm
You want
sorry.
the light on?
I think is somebody talking to somebody else? Yeah. Okay. So hopefully we'll see you all next month, and thank you very much for the presentation, Kevin.
Great. Thank you again for the
Okay.
invitation.
Uh-huh.
Thank you.
Okay. Right, see you. Bye-bye.